The late afternoon sun was starting to sink behind the trees as Officer Reynolds checked his watch. Just 2 more hours until his shift ended. It had been a quiet day in the small town of Riverdale, the kind of day where the biggest excitement was helping Mrs. Wilson find her lost cat. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel of his patrol car, parked just off Highway 16 where the speed limit dropped from 55 to 35. Most locals knew to slow down here, but out-of-towners often missed the sign. Officer Reynolds had been with the Riverdale Police Department for 10 years now. He wasn't the kind of cop who got a thrill from giving tickets. He preferred to give warnings when he could, especially to folks who seemed genuinely sorry. His fellow officers sometimes teased him for being too soft, but Reynolds believed in second chances. "Unit 14, what's your 20? The radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice. "Highway 16, near the county line," Reynolds responded, stifling a yawn. Just as he finished speaking, a silver sedan flew past him. The radar gun clocked it at 52 miles per hour, 17 over the limit. Reynolds sighed, flicked on his lights, and pulled out onto the road. The sedan continued for another 30 seconds before finally pulling over to the shoulder. Reynolds noticed the car drifting slightly as it stopped, a possible sign that the driver was distracted or impaired. "Dispatch, I'm making a traffic stop on Highway 16. Silver sedan, license plate Adam David Victor 3249. As Reynolds approached the vehicle, he noticed the driver was fumbling with something in the glove compartment. He tapped his flashlight against the window, making the young girl inside jump. She rolled down her window. Little did Officer Reynolds know, as he secured the teenager in his patrol car, that his routine traffic stop was about to become the most challenging situation of his career. And it all hinged on one critical piece of information he hadn't discovered yet: the identity of the girl's father. Officer Reynolds returned to the silver sedan, flashlight in hand. The evening was growing darker, and he switched on his shoulder radio to keep dispatch informed. "Going to conduct a search of the vehicle," he reported, his voice calm and professional despite the growing tension in the air. Lisa sat in the back of the patrol car, her face pressed against the window as she watched the officer methodically search her car. Her stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. Reynolds started with the driver's side, checking under the seat and in the door compartments. Nothing unusual there. The center console contained the usual teenage items: hair ties, lip balm, and an old candy wrapper. When he moved to the passenger side, he knelt down and reached under the seat where he had seen Lisa try to kick something earlier. His hand closed around a small plastic bag, but it turned out to be empty. Just as he was about to stand back up, his flashlight beam caught the reflection of glass. Reaching further under the seat, his fingers touched the cool surface of a bottle. He carefully pulled it out, a half-empty bottle of vodka with the seal broken. Reynolds sighed heavily. This wasn't looking good for the young driver. "Found something," called his partner Officer Chen, who had just arrived as backup. Reynolds held up the bottle. "Looks like our young friend might have been doing more than just speeding." Back in the patrol car, Lisa's eyes widened at the sight of the bottle. She began to frantically tap on the window. "That's not mine," she called out when Reynolds approached. "I swear. My friend Katie must have left it there after the party last weekend. I didn't even know it was in my car." Reynolds opened the door slightly. "The bottle is half empty, and there's a smell of alcohol coming from you. Were you drinking today?" "No." "Well, maybe I had one sip when they passed it around, but that's it. I'm the designated driver. That's why I was taking everyone home." Her story had shifted again. "I thought you said you were coming from a study group," Reynolds reminded her. Lisa's face fell. "Okay, I wasn't at a study group. We were at my friend's house because her parents are out of town. Some kids brought alcohol, but I really didn't drink much." Reynolds noticed how her story kept changing. First a study group, then just getting home before her dad found out. Now a party where she was the designated driver. None of it was adding up. "Step out of the car, please," he instructed, helping her out of the back seat. "Am I under arrest?" Liz's voice trembled. "Not yet. I'm going to conduct a field sobriety test." Lisa's eyes darted around nervously. A few cars had slowed down as they passed, drivers curious about the police lights. She looked mortified at the thought of someone she knew driving by. Can we please do this somewhere else? What if someone from school sees me? I'm afraid we need to do this now, Reynolds explained. I need you to walk in a straight line for me, heel to toe. Lisa attempted the walk, but her balance was slightly off. When Reynolds asked her to stand on one leg, she wobbled noticeably. Her eyes looked glassy in the patrol car's headlights. I'm going to need you to take a breathalyzer test, Reynolds said, retrieving the device from his car. Do I have to? Lisa asked, her voice small. In this state, driving a vehicle means you've given implied consent to sobriety testing. Refusing can result in automatic suspension of your license. Lisa reluctantly agreed to the test. When she blew into the device, Reynolds looked at the reading, 0.04%. Not legally drunk for an adult, but for someone under 21, any alcohol in the system was illegal. Lisa, I'm detaining you for underage drinking and driving with alcohol in your system. We'll need to take you to the station to process you and contact your parents. No, please, you don't understand. Lisa's voice rose in panic. My dad will lose it. He doesn't know I went to that party. He thinks I'm at the library. Reynolds felt a twinge of sympathy. He remembered being a teenager and making poor choices, but sympathy couldn't override his duty. I'm sorry, but I have to follow procedure here. You're a minor with alcohol in your system, behind the wheel of a car. That's serious. As Officer Chen arranged for Lisa's car to be towed, Reynolds carefully placed the vodka bottle in an evidence bag. Lisa watched, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Can I at least call my dad myself? She asked as Reynolds helped her back into the patrol car. When we get to the station, he promised. The drive to the police station was mostly silent. Reynolds occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror at Lisa, who stared out the window with tears streaming down her face. It's going to be okay, he said, trying to reassure her. This is a first offense and nobody got hurt. The courts usually go easier on minors. You don't get it, Lisa whispered. It's not the courts I'm worried about. Reynolds had no way of knowing just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The identity of Lisa's father was about to turn this routine detention into something far more complicated than he could have imagined. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Reynolds led Lisa through the front doors. The night shift had just come on, and the station was relatively quiet except for the constant ringing of phones and the occasional burst of radio chatter. First time bringing in a teenager? Asked Officer Wilson from behind the front desk. He was an older cop with graying hair who'd seen it all in his 30 years on the force. You know, I've brought in plenty, Reynolds replied, guiding Lisa toward a bench near the processing area. But it's never something I enjoy. Lisa sat down, hugging herself as if she were cold despite the warmth of the station. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the wanted posters on the bulletin board and the officers moving about their business. Can I please make that phone call now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Reynolds nodded. Let's get your paperwork started first, then you can call your parents. Parent. Lisa corrected. It's just my dad. As Reynolds filled out the initial forms, Lisa became increasingly agitated. She kept checking the clock on the wall, her leg bouncing up and down with nervous energy. My dad checks on me every night at 9, she explained when she caught Reynolds watching her. He's probably already wondering where I am. Reynolds felt a twinge of sympathy. He had a teenage daughter himself and knew the worry that came with parenting. We'll get you that phone soon, he promised. The processing didn't take long. Lisa's fingerprints were taken, her personal items were catalogued and placed in a plastic bin, and her information was entered into the system. She was officially in the juvenile detention system now, though she wouldn't be held overnight for a first offense like this. All right, Reynolds said, leading her to a small room with a phone on the wall. You can make your call now. I'll give you some privacy, but I'll be right outside the door. Lisa's hand trembled as she picked up the receiver. She stared at the keypad for a long moment before finally dialing a number she knew by heart. Reynolds stood just outside the door, giving her the promised privacy while still keeping an eye on her through the small window. He watched as Lisa's shoulders tensed when someone apparently answered. Dad, she said, her voice breaking. There was a pause as she listened. I'm at the police station. I got pulled over. Another pause. No, I'm okay. But I'm in trouble. Reynolds couldn't hear the voice on the other end of the line, but he could see Lisa's reactions. Her face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know, Dad. I'm sorry. I was at Katie's house, and..." Her explanation was cut short by whatever her father said next. "Officer Reynolds brought me in. He found a bottle in my car." Lisa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Yes, he's right here." She looked up suddenly, making eye contact with Reynolds through the window. Her expression had changed from fear to something else, almost like pity. "He wants to speak with you," she said as Reynolds opened the door. Reynolds took the phone, expecting the typical angry parent response he'd heard countless times before. "This is Officer Reynolds." The voice that came through the receiver was calm, measured, and chillingly familiar. "Officer David Reynolds, badge number 4872, Riverdale Police Department." Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't a question. The man knew his full name and badge number without being told. "Yes, sir," Reynolds managed to reply. "This is Judge Robert Harrington." Reynolds nearly dropped the phone. Judge Harrington, Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. The same judge who had made headlines last month for his unprecedented ruling that increased penalties for police procedural violations. The judge who had personally ended the careers of 3 officers in the neighboring county for mishandling evidence. "I understand you've detained my daughter," the judge continued, his voice maintaining that dangerous calm. "Yes, Your Honor," Reynolds said, struggling to keep his own voice steady. "She was speeding and had alcohol in her system. There was an open container in the vehicle." "I see." The 2 simple words carried immense weight. "And was my daughter read her rights?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Was the breathalyzer properly calibrated?" "Yes, Your Honor. It was checked at the beginning of my shift." "And you had probable cause for the search of her vehicle?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor. There was a detectable odor of alcohol, and I observed her attempting to conceal something under the seat." There was a long pause, so long that Reynolds wondered if the judge had hung up. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Officer Reynolds," Judge Harrington finally said. "I expect to review all your documentation upon arrival. Every single form." "Of course, Your Honor." "And, Officer, if I find even one procedural error in how you've handled this situation, I want you to understand exactly what that will mean for your career." The line went dead before Reynolds could respond. He slowly hung up the phone, aware that Lisa was watching him with red-rimmed eyes. "You didn't tell me your father is Judge Harrington," he said, his mouth suddenly dry. "Would it have made a difference?" Lisa asked quietly. Reynolds wanted to say no, that he treated everyone equally under the law. But the cold sweat breaking out on his forehead suggested otherwise. Judge Harrington had the power to not just end his career, but to make an example of him that would follow him for life. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, Reynolds said, trying to sound professional despite the knot forming in his stomach. Lisa nodded, a look of resigned dread on her face. "I know my dad. He's already looking for every mistake he might have made. That's what he does." As Reynolds led her back to the bench, he mentally retraced every step of the traffic stop, the search, the sobriety test, and the arrest procedure. Had he followed every protocol exactly? Had he dotted every I and crossed every T? His career, everything he'd worked for over the past decade, now hung in the balance. And the clock on the wall showed that Judge Harrington would be arriving in just 19 minutes. Officer Reynolds paced the warm linoleum floor of the station's break room, a half-empty cup of cold coffee forgotten in his hand. The clock on the wall seemed to be moving faster than usual, each tick bringing Judge Harrington closer to the station. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Officer Wilson commented as he entered the room. "What's going on?" Reynolds set down his cup with a shaky hand. "The girl I brought in for underage drinking. Her father is Judge Robert Harrington." Wilson's eyes widened. "The state Supreme Court judge? The one they call the Hammer?" "The very same," Reynolds confirmed, loosening his collar, which suddenly felt too tight. "Man, that's rough," Wilson said, leaning against the counter. "He's put away more cops than criminals, from what I hear." Reynolds ran a hand through his hair. "I've got less than 15 minutes to make sure every piece of paperwork is perfect. One mistake and I'm done. Need help?" Wilson offered, already reaching for the case folder on the table. Together, they went through every form, every notation, checking for errors. Reynolds described the entire stop in detail, making sure he hadn't missed any procedural steps. "The breathalyzer was calibrated this morning, right?" Wilson asked. "Yes, I did it myself and logged it." "And you had clear probable cause for the search?" "She tried to hide something under the seat when I approached the vehicle. Plus, I could smell alcohol." Wilson nodded. "Sounds like you did everything by the book. But with Harrington, that might not be enough." A young desk officer poked his head into the break room, looking nervous. "Reynolds, there's a black town car pulling up outside. Looks official." Reynolds took a deep breath and straightened his uniform. "That'll be the judge." Walking back to the reception area, he saw Lisa still sitting on the bench, head down. When she heard his footsteps, she looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Is he here?" she asked. "About to be," Reynolds answered. "You okay?" Lisa gave a small, bitter laugh. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." Before Reynolds could respond, the station's front doors swung open. The man who walked in wasn't physically imposing. Average height, trim build, silver hair neatly combed, but his presence immediately commanded attention. He wore an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the small-town police station. Judge Harrington's eyes scanned the room and locked onto his daughter. His expression remained neutral, betraying no emotion as he approached. "Lisa," he said simply. "Dad." "I'm so sorry," she began, standing up quickly. The judge held up a hand, silencing her. "We'll discuss this at home." His voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable authority. He turned to Reynolds. "I assume you're the arresting officer." "Yes, Your Honor," Reynolds replied, standing straighter than he had during military inspection. "I'd like to see your report, the evidence and all related documentation," the judge said. His tone was professional, almost clinical. "Somewhere private would be preferable." Captain Thompson had emerged from his office, clearly having been alerted to the high-profile visitor. "You can use my office, Judge Harrington," he offered, looking nearly as nervous as Reynolds felt. The judge nodded curtly and turned to his daughter. "Wait here." As Reynolds followed the judge and the captain into the office, he felt like a man walking to his own execution. He'd heard the stories about Judge Harrington's exacting standards and zero tolerance for police errors, but he'd never expected to be on the receiving end of that scrutiny. Inside the office, Judge Harrington took the captain's seat without being offered, a subtle power move that wasn't lost on anyone. He held out his hand for the file, which Reynolds handed over with minimal trembling. For several excruciating minutes, the judge read through the paperwork in complete silence. His face revealed nothing as his eyes methodically scanned each form, each notation. "Tell me about the traffic stop," he finally said, not looking up from the file. Reynolds cleared his throat. "I was parked at the reduced speed zone on Highway 16. Your daughter's vehicle passed at 52 miles per hour in a 35 zone. When I approached the vehicle, I detected the smell of alcohol and observed her attempting to conceal something under the passenger seat." The judge looked up, his gray eyes cold. "And this gave you probable cause for a search?" "Yes, Your Honor." That, combined with her nervous behavior and inconsistent statements about where she was coming from. "I see." The judge flipped to another page. "The breathalyzer shows 0.04%. Not legally drunk for an adult, but any alcohol in a minor's system while driving is illegal in this state," Reynolds finished, immediately regretting interrupting the judge. To his surprise, Judge Harrington nodded. "Indeed it is." He closed the file and leaned back in the chair, studying Reynolds with an unnerving intensity. "Do you know who I am, Officer Reynolds? Beyond my title?" "You're the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court," Reynolds answered. "I'm also the author of the Henderson decision last year that established stricter guidelines for police conduct. I personally reviewed the cases that led to 3 officers in Clayton County losing their badges." The judge leaned forward. "I have built my career on holding law enforcement to the highest possible standard." Reynolds felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you know why I'm telling you this?" "I can guess, sir." The judge's eyes never left Reynolds' face. "My daughter is not above the law, Officer Reynolds, but neither are you. If I find that you've cut corners, violated her rights, or deviated from proper procedure in any way, I will ensure that your career in law enforcement is over. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Your Honor." Judge Harrington opened the file again, this time pulling out the evidence photos. "Show me exactly where this bottle was found." As Reynolds began explaining the details of the search, he realized he was facing the most important test of his career. Every decision he had made during that traffic stop would now be scrutinized by one of the most powerful legal minds in the state, a man who happened to be the father of the girl he had detained. And from the look in Judge Harrington's eyes, he wasn't inclined to be merciful. The captain's office felt smaller by the minute as Judge Harrington continued his relentless questioning. For nearly 45 minutes, he had picked apart every detail of the traffic stop, the field sobriety test, and the vehicle search. Outside the office windows, Reynolds could see other officers stealing glances their way, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "And you're certain the bottle was under the passenger seat?" The judge asked for what seemed like the third time. "Yes, Your Honor," Reynolds replied, fighting to keep the wariness from his voice. "It was pushed all the way back, but clearly visible with my flashlight." Judge Harrington made another note on the legal pad he'd pulled from his briefcase. The yellow paper was now covered in his precise handwriting. "One final question for now," the judge said, capping his pen. "At any point, did you consider letting my daughter go with just a warning?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Reynolds felt a cold trickle of sweat run down his back as he considered his answer. This was no casual inquiry. This was the heart of the matter. "I need a moment with the evidence, Your Honor," Reynolds said, buying himself time to think. He stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. Officer Chen approached with a concerned look. "How's it going in there?" Chen asked quietly. Reynolds rubbed his temples, like being slowly dissected. He just asked if I ever considered letting her off with a warning. Chen's eyebrows shot up. "Careful with that one. Sounds like he's testing you." "I know," Reynolds said, staring at the floor. "And I honestly did consider it for a split second when I first saw her age on her license. But there was alcohol involved." "So what are you going to tell him?" "The truth, I guess. What choice do I have?" Chen put a hand on his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I think you handled the stop perfectly. Don't let him get into your head." Reynolds nodded gratefully and headed to the evidence room. As he signed out the sealed bottle of vodka, his mind raced with possibilities. The conversation waiting for him back in the captain's office could go in several directions, none of them comfortable. He found himself at a crossroads. On one hand, he could try to appease the judge by suggesting he had given Liza every possible break. Maybe hint that he could still drop the charges if the judge wanted to handle it within the family. It wouldn't be the first time an influential parent had gotten their child out of trouble. On the other hand, he could stand by his decision and face whatever consequences came with it. His entire career, 10 years of service, countless hours of overtime, missing his own daughter's birthday parties for the job, all of it could be wiped away if Judge Harrington decided to make an example of him. Walking back toward the captain's office, Reynolds passed the bench where Lisa still sat. She looked up at him with those same frightened eyes he'd seen during the traffic stop. "Is he going to get you fired?" she asked in a small voice. The question surprised him. "I didn't think you'd care, considering I'm the one who brought you in." Lisa shrugged. "My dad always says there are two types of cops, those who follow the rules and those who think they're above them." She looked down at her hands. "You seemed like the first kind." Something about her words strengthened Reynolds' resolve. He continued to the captain's office, evidence bag in hand, and closed the door behind him. Judge Harrington looked up from his notes. "You haven't answered my question, officer. Did you consider letting my daughter go with just a warning?" Reynolds placed the evidence bag on the desk and sat down, meeting the judge's gaze directly for the first time. "Yes, I did," he admitted, "for about half a second when I first realized how young she was. Then I remembered my training and the oath I took." The judge's expression remained unreadable. "And what oath was that?" "To uphold the law equally for everyone, regardless of their age, race, wealth, or—" Reynolds paused briefly, "who their parents might be." A tense silence filled the room. The judge's pen tapped against his legal pad in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "I had options," Reynolds continued, surprising himself with his candor. "I could have looked the other way. I could have driven her home and had a stern talk with you. I could have lost the evidence or claimed the breathalyzer was malfunctioning. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. But you didn't. No, sir, I didn't. Because that's not why I became a police officer. Even knowing who I am and the potential consequences to your career. Reynolds took a deep breath. Your Honor, when I pulled your daughter over, I didn't know who her father was. And if I had known, I hope I would have made the same decisions anyway. You hope? The judge pressed. I'm being honest with you. I can't say for certain what I would have done in a hypothetical situation, but I can tell you this. I believe no one should be above the law, and no one should be beneath its protection either. Judge Harrington studied him for a long moment, his expression giving nothing away. Then he closed his notebook and stood up. I'd like to see my daughter now, he said. And Officer Reynolds. I'll need copies of all this documentation. Reynolds nodded, uncertain of what had just happened. Had he passed some kind of test? Or had he just sealed his fate by standing his ground? As the judge walked past him toward the door, he added, We're not finished here. I'll see you in the main office in 10 minutes. Left alone in the captain's office, Reynolds slumped in his chair, mentally exhausted. Whatever came next, whether praise or punishment, he knew he had chosen integrity over expediency. Whether that choice would cost him his badge remained to be seen. Word had spread quickly through the station. By the time Reynolds emerged from the captain's office, it seemed like every officer on duty had found some reason to be in or near the main room. Some were pretending to file paperwork. Others leaned against walls, sipping coffee with forced casualness. All eyes darted between Reynolds, Lisa, and the closed door where Judge Harrington was now speaking privately with his daughter. You okay? Officer Chen whispered as Reynolds passed. Ask me in 10 minutes, Reynolds replied. Captain Thompson approached, his face tight with concern. What's happening, Reynolds? Half the department's calling me asking if you're about to be crucified by the judge. Reynolds shrugged. Your guess is as good as mine, sir. Well, whatever happens, you've got our support, the captain said. I reviewed your paperwork. Everything was by the book. The station fell silent as the door to the side room opened. Judge Harrington emerged first, his face unreadable. Lisa followed, eyes downcast, her shoulders slumped in resignation. The judge scanned the room, taking in the gathered officers with a slightly raised eyebrow. Quite the audience, he noted dryly. Officer Reynolds, Captain Thompson, might we continue our discussion? The captain gestured toward the conference room. In here, Your Honor. As they walked toward the room, Reynolds noticed something unexpected. Chief Andrews had arrived. The chief rarely came to the station this late unless something major was happening. He stood at the far end of the hallway, watching the proceedings with an intense expression. Inside the conference room, Judge Harrington took a seat at the head of the table without waiting for an invitation. The captain sat to his right, while Reynolds took a chair directly across from the judge. Chief Andrews entered last, closing the door behind him. Chief, the judge acknowledged with a nod. I wasn't aware we needed the department's highest-ranking officer for this matter. When a state Supreme Court justice visits our station unexpectedly, I make it my business to be here, the chief replied evenly. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Outside, through the conference room's windows, Reynolds could see officers gathering, their concerned faces making no pretense of doing anything else. Well, Judge Harrington began, folding his hands on the table. I've reviewed the case thoroughly and spoken with my daughter. Reynolds braced himself. This was it, the moment that could end his career. Before I give my assessment, I'd like to hear from Officer Reynolds one more time, the judge continued. Officer, please walk us through your handling of this case, step by step, in your own words. Reynolds took a deep breath and began recounting the evening's events. He described the traffic stop, the signs of potential intoxication, the field sobriety test, and the discovery of the vodka bottle. He explained his decision-making process at each step, keeping his tone professional. And at no point did you recognize who my daughter was. The judge interrupted. No, Your Honor. I had no idea until she called you from the station. The judge nodded slowly, then turned to the chief. Chief Andrews, what is your department's policy regarding underage drinking and driving? Zero tolerance, the chief answered promptly. Any alcohol in the system of a driver under 21 results in immediate processing. Even for the children of prominent citizens, the judge pressed. The policy doesn't list exceptions, Your Honor. Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, studying each of their faces in turn. The room was so quiet that Reynolds could hear the ticking of the wall clock. My daughter tells me, the judge finally said, that Officer Reynolds was professional and respectful throughout this process. She also admits that she lied to him multiple times about where she had been and what she had been doing. Reynolds tried to keep his face neutral, though he was surprised by this admission. However, the judge continued, his voice hardening. She is 17 years old. She made a serious error in judgment today. One that could have had far more severe consequences than spending a few hours in a police station. Judge Harrington stood up suddenly and walked to the window, looking out at the gathered officers. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he turned back, his face showed the first real emotion Reynolds had seen, a mixture of anger and sadness. Do you know what happens to public servants who fail to enforce the law equally, Captain Thompson? The judge asked. The captain shifted uncomfortably. I imagine they face disciplinary action, Your Honor. They undermine the very foundation of our justice system, the judge corrected. When rules apply differently based on wealth, power, or connections, we no longer have justice. We have privilege masquerading as law. The judge returned to the table but remained standing. I've made my career holding police officers accountable when they abuse their authority or show favoritism. Today, I find myself in the uncomfortable position of being the parent who might benefit from such favoritism. Reynolds felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Where was this going? My daughter broke the law, Judge Harrington stated firmly. She endangered herself and others. She lied to a police officer, and she expected her father's position to shield her from consequences. He turned to face Reynolds directly. Officer Reynolds, I have reviewed your work thoroughly. I have questioned your methods, scrutinized your evidence, and examined your paperwork with the same rigor I apply in my courtroom. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. And I can find no fault in how you handled this situation. You followed procedure exactingly. You showed no bias, no favoritism, and no misconception of your duty. The judge extended his hand across the table. You did your job, officer. Exactly as you should have. Reynolds stared at the offered hand in disbelief before reaching out to shake it. The tension that had been building for hours suddenly released like air from a balloon. Outside the conference room, the gathered officers erupted in surprised chatter. Through the window, Reynolds could see them exchanging looks of relief and amazement. But sir, Reynolds found himself saying, I thought you were going to end your career? Judge Harrington finished with a small smile. Only if you had failed to treat my daughter like any other citizen, that would have proven you unworthy of the badge you wear. The judge picked up his briefcase. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to take my daughter home. She has a court date to prepare for, one that neither her father's position nor his influence will affect in any way. As Judge Harrington walked toward the door, he paused beside Reynolds. Though I must admit, he said quietly, I'm relieved to find an officer who remembered his oath even when tested. Everyone in the police station held their breath. The air felt heavy as they waited for the judge to speak. Officer Reynolds stood tall, though inside his heart was racing. He had done everything by the book, but this was no ordinary situation. Judge Harrington looked at his daughter and then back at the officer. His face showed no emotion at first. Then, to everyone's surprise, he extended his hand to Officer Reynolds. My daughter broke the law, he said in a clear, firm voice that echoed through the quiet room. And you did your job exactly as you should have. The other officers exchanged glances of disbelief. The station captain's shoulders visibly relaxed. Sir, I was just following protocol, Officer Reynolds said as he shook the judge's hand. That's exactly what I would expect from a good officer, the judge replied. Too many people think rules don't apply to them or their families. That's not how justice works. The judge turned to his daughter Lisa, who looked down at her shoes, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. You made a poor choice tonight, he told her. And now you'll face the consequences like anyone else would. In the days that followed, Lisa completed her processing through the system like any other first-time offender. No strings were pulled, no favors called in. She was assigned to an alcohol education program and 40 hours of community service at the local animal shelter. Word of what happened spread quickly through the department. Officers who had been cutting corners suddenly found themselves being more careful. If the judge's daughter wasn't above the law, no one was. Officer Reynolds found a note on his desk one morning, inviting him to lunch. When he arrived at the small diner downtown, Judge Harrington was waiting. "I wanted to thank you properly," the judge said as they sat down. "It would have been easy to look the other way when you realized who Lisa was." Officer Reynolds stirred his coffee. "To be honest, sir, I was terrified when I heard your voice on the phone." The judge laughed. "Most people are. But you did the right thing anyway. That's real courage." Over the next few months, a surprising friendship formed between the officer and the judge. They met regularly to discuss cases and challenges in the justice system. The judge even invited Officer Reynolds to speak at the law school about police ethics. As for Lisa, the experience changed her in ways no one expected. The hours at the animal shelter turned into a volunteer position even after her community service ended. She started to see the law from a different perspective. 3 years later, Officer Reynolds was patrolling near the university when a young woman approached him. It took him a moment to recognize her. "Officer Reynolds," Lisa said with a smile. "I'm not sure if you remember me." "Of course I do," he replied. "How have you been?" "I'm good, really good actually. I'm studying criminal justice now." She shifted her books to her other arm. "That night you pulled me over was the worst night of my life at the time. But looking back, it might have been the most important." Officer Reynolds nodded, noticing how much more confident she seemed now. "My dad always talked about justice being blind, but I never really understood what that meant until then," she continued. "I want to help make sure the system works the same for everyone." When Officer Reynolds was promoted to sergeant the following spring, he spotted Judge Harrington and Lisa sitting in the back row of the ceremony. The judge gave him a subtle nod of respect. The story of that traffic stop became something of a legend at the police academy. Instructors used it as a perfect example of maintaining integrity under pressure. New officers would hear about how one night, one decision, changed multiple lives for the better. What could have been a career-ending disaster had instead become Officer Reynolds' proudest moment. Not because he had caught someone breaking the law, but because he had shown that the law truly applied to everyone, even when it would have been easier to look the other way.